For a Latin American audience, we're going to be remarkably prompt, given the schedule of the members of Congress. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. I'm Cindy Arnson, Director of the Latin American Program, and it is really a pleasure to invite two very distinguished members of Congress, a Republican and a Democrat, the chair and the ranking member of the House Western Hemisphere Subcommittee. It has a long and complicated name, but I think we all know that it's the Subcommittee of the House Foreign Affairs Committee that has oversight over Latin America. So we are really pleased to have Albio Sires, Democrat of New Jersey, Frank Rooney, Republican of the state of Florida, with us this morning for what I think the Wilson Center tries to excel at, which is to have conversations across the aisle, not that people always find a middle ground, but at least there is a place where you can talk about ideas from different perspectives and different political parties. And I think that both Representative Sires and Representative Rooney have embodied that spirit in their leadership of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee and have constantly not only striven to speak with one another, but to speak with their colleagues and others in the House more broadly who might be interested in Latin America or who might be paying attention to the extent that there are that many, and to bring people together around a common agenda. And it's something that I think we all value and admire, that is rare in the times that we live in, and so we're especially pleased to have this conversation. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Benjamin Gadan, Deputy Director of Latin American Program, who will be moderating this discussion and leaving time for your questions. Thank you. Benjamin.
Thanks. I will indeed. I think lately who focus on Latin America have been fortunate to find more attention to the region, not always for positive developments, but we are relying increasingly on the talents of those in government and in policy-making positions who have expertise and interest in this hemisphere. With that in mind and the number of issues we want to discuss in our limited time, I'm going to dive right in, if you will permit me. And I wanted to start with Central America and the so-called Northern Triangle countries of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. There had been bipartisan and cross branches consensus on how to approach the root causes of these migration issues, dating back to and even before 2014 and the surge in unaccompanied minors, that the U.S. government response would involve addressing these so-called root causes of the migration, including violence and lack of economic opportunities. That is no longer the official approach, at least from the executive branch, to the crisis. And in fact, we've seen a suspension of U.S. foreign assistance that has disrupted dramatically many of these foreign assistance programs. Mr. Chairman, I wanted to start with you and just ask your view and the view from Congress of the suspension of that assistance and how you've been addressing it in appropriations of late.
Well, before I get started, I want to thank my ranking member. We have a great relationship. We worked on many issues together, and I'm very fortunate that we have a committee that works so well together. So I'm happy that he's sitting next to me here so we can have a discussion on how we feel about the Western Hemisphere, actually. Let me say that I've been on this committee for 13 years, since I got to Congress, for obvious reasons. I'm a Cuban American. I'm passionate about the region. I'm passionate about Cuba. And I'm concerned about the region. I have always felt that this country does not pay enough attention to this region. And I have tried to express that on many of the hearings, that we have to focus on this part of the world. Unfortunately, things are focusing now on other places, and it doesn't seem that this region gets the attention that we should be giving it, because our void in this area means that the Chinese will move in and the Russians will move in, and some of the other people, some of the other actors that are active now in the region. As far as the Northern Triangle, if you take away money from some of the programs that have been successful in this region, you're going to have people exiting. That's just a fact. I've been to some of these programs. I was there with Ileana Rose-Layton a couple of times when she was the chairman, and I saw some of the programs that were effective with the little money that we invested in. Having an administration that cuts these programs, I certainly do not agree with. I think that our investment should be a little more, should be healthier in terms of trying to establish some of these programs that help the people of these countries. I am not, and I say this again, for a blank check to these countries. I feel that the impact of the money that we give them, it's much better use if we go through some of the NGOs or some of the social groups that are there that deal directly with the people in those countries. So I guess that's how I feel about some of these countries, because there's a lot of corruption, and American people work very hard for the money, and we have to make sure that the money that we allocate for these places are spent doing the best possible job it can for the people of those places. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll let the ranking member respond to the question, if he wants to.
Well, first, I want to thank you, Albio. It's a pleasure to be your partner and to work for your committee. And we do have whatever's not broken about Congress pretty much is focused on Albio's committee, bipartisan efforts to work together. And I appreciate the chance to be here. As an example of that, it was hours after Trump cut off the $500 million where we voted to put it back and succeeded in getting like 143 spent in 2019 money, with the whole $500 million back for future years. And that was totally bipartisan. Nobody in the whole Foreign Affairs Committee was against that. As the chairman mentioned, there's China out there. Fortunately, I think the State Department did a good job of stopping that port in El Salvador. But now Bukele has come in and wants to do another big deal with China that he announced in December of 2019. So, we've got to be on the table helping out. And as the chairman said, there's been a lot of good work done by NGOs in humanitarian areas, helping the migrants, helping deal with the climate change problems in the farming areas of Guatemala. And I think we need to do more to institutionally develop them and give them a chance to stand on their own feet. That's the only way you're going to fight corruption is la barriga llena, no? And that's what we need to do. I guess that's the main thing. I mean, I'm a little concerned about the Washington Post today, the article about the Guatemalan, the refugees that get to the United States are being sent back to Guatemala. I mean, some of those is condemning them to a pretty bad fate if they came from Honduras.
I thought maybe, Congressman Rooney, we could focus a bit more on China. There was a sense that Chairman referenced that there's a U.S. void, and that void is very quickly filled by China. I mean, some of that seems inevitable. I mean, you've done business in Latin America. There's great infrastructure needs, and there's some very attractive Chinese financing that's being made available. But some of it is attributed to the idea that the U.S. is simply not present. I think the current U.S. president has been to the region once during his term, was the first U.S. president not to attend the Summit of the Americas. There is a sense in general that the U.S. is not active in the region, and that is one of the explanations for why there's greater Chinese economic presence, political influence, cultural influence even, with greater exchange programs for young people in the region and members of the militaries of the region. And also we've seen it potentially in the Taiwan issue. So I wonder if you think this is a trend that is reversible, or at least that the U.S. could have some influence on the growth of Chinese influence and presence in the region.
Well, you know that they offered to finance the widening of the Panama Canal 100%, all $4 or $5 billion of it. And we decided, the board that I was on decided right away that we needed to have a global partnership to finance the canal. That shows you how aggressive they are. Just like the Salvador thing, we got like 20% of the country for this port. So as the chairman said, they're insidious and they're aggressive. And hopefully we can do better with our aid, with the Build Act and things like that. Maybe bring some more private capital there back with the United States to compete with them. And it's not just Western Hemisphere, it's all over Africa. You know, it's in the Caribbean. The Chinese are everywhere.
You know, one of the things that I use to reverse the influence of the Chinese is the deal that they cut with Ecuador. You know, they came in and they said they were going to build a dam. They were going to do this. They gave them all this money. And it turns out that the dam is cracking. Some of the projects are horrible. They use their own labor. They don't help the Ecuadorian people at all. Now Ecuador is on the hook for, I don't know, $800 billion, something like that, some ridiculous number, where Ecuador has to turn over most of their oil to the Chinese. And the Chinese take the oil and sell it in the market as a profit. So when people come to my office, which they come often, and I try to bring up the issue of China, and, you know, I tell them, I said, is that the kind of deal you want for your country? Is that the kind of people you want, that they come in and they don't even use your own labor? How does that help you? But again, everybody tells me the same thing. You know, there is a void here. And they're willing to step in, and some of them are willing to accept lousy deals for some of the money that China is throwing around. That's why I always say that we have to get more active, involved. Because when we go in there, we don't go in there and say you have to use Americans or this or that. You know, we try to help those countries get on their feet. And the Chinese go in there and it's all self-interest. Whether it's minerals, whether it's oil, that's all they care about. So, again, it's partly our doing that these Chinese are all over the place. And they come in and they throw money, even as close as Dominican Republic. Mm-hmm. They're throwing out, they're giving them money for a...
they gave a soccer stadium in Antigua to get a UN vote.
Well, so let me ask about that in terms of the scale of U.S. financing and support for infrastructure in Latin America. I mean, Congressman Rooney, you mentioned the reorganization of some of our export credit agencies in the Build Act, but is it nearly enough to compete with what China has to offer? I mean, the argument that the Chinese projects are suboptimal in terms of quality or the use of Chinese labor, it seems like it's not enough to dissuade governments who don't have an alternative in Washington for seeking this type of financing. Do either of you have the sense that the reorganization of our aid agencies is sufficient, of the export credit agencies is sufficient to address this void, or does much greater scale of financing needed?
Go ahead.
Well, I think we're really in a tough spot. I mean, they don't have a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. They're unremitting in their willingness to spend money that ultimately they may pay a piper for, but they're not paying it yet, and to deploy their people, as the chairman said. We may have this new thing in Guyana with Exxon wanting to sell its interest in the oil fields. China's probably going to buy that. They're going to go from 30% to 60 or 70% of that oil field.
Actually, I'm glad you brought up Guyana, because on Tuesday I'm heading for Guyana. I have a group of people coming with me. We want to talk to, obviously, the people in Guyana, and we're concerned. We're concerned that China may just step right in and throw money around. We're concerned that about, obviously, elections and the people that are in charge in Guyana to do the right thing. And we'll see when we meet with the people in Guyana.
Now, I know we're not talking about Venezuela yet.
Yes.
I have personal experience in Venezuela. When Chavez took our oil rigs, he gave them to the Chinese, and the Chinese are operating all of our 14 rigs, as well as Santa Fe, the Kuwaitis rigs.
Yeah, well, let's talk about Venezuela. I mean, Venezuela is
We can
is
talk
where
here
China...
for 2 hours about Venezuela.
I mean, you can talk about it, many aspects of it. I mean, one of them is the China role. It's the place where China has invested, most deeply and arguably has the most influence over the course of events. But maybe stepping back from China, I want to talk, Chairman, you went on a trip to the border to Cúcuta in Colombia not long ago. and came back with accounts of real shocking levels of human suffering, malnourished children, groups of displaced Venezuelans desperately searching for life-saving medications. Congress has been active on this issue, including the Verdad Act to greatly increase, I think, by $400 million U.S. foreign assistance, to strengthen sanctions. I just want to hear from the congressional perspective, starting with you, Mr. Chairman, and then Congressman Rooney, about about Congress's role in addressing the Venezuela crisis, whether you think the administration has it right now that we've seen more than a year since the recognition of Juan Guaido, a couple of very dramatic attempts to change the politics in this failed state that have left us with what is widely perceived as an impasse and a lingering inability to address the humanitarian crisis that you witnessed. We can talk afterward about the migration and the issues that it has raised for neighbors. But let's start with a policy conversation.
Well, we all were very hopeful that Guaido, it will lead to elections. The prospect of elections now seem a little far away, but we all felt that by pushing for election, we would get there. Right now, I think we're in an impasse, and I just saw the administration made an effort to some sort of negotiations with the Maduro government, some sort of an effort. My concern with Venezuela is if we don't play this right, you're going to have another Cuba in your hands. And you're going to have another Venezuela that's going to disrupt this whole region. I personally think, and this is my own thinking, is that the fact that you have almost, by the end of this year, 6 million people leaving Venezuela, that is an effort to destabilize the whole region. Venezuelans are as far down as Chile, Argentina, Uruguay. They have some like 700,000 Venezuelans in Peru. Ecuador has another 300,000-400,000. I think that serves as a destabilizing factor in the region. And when there's destabilizing factors in these countries, you never know what the outcome is going to be. And I am very concerned about Venezuela. I think the administration has tried to put some strong sanctions. The Europeans doesn't seem to do anything about it because the Europeans are just, well, they got their own problems, but, we will always count on the Europeans to at least be there for some of these humanitarian issues, and it doesn't seem that they're paying much attention. So let's see where this leads us now that maybe there's a new approach. I don't think a military approach is a good approach. I don't think that's the answer, especially with the history that we have with this part of the world. So I'll let the ranking member tell you about his opinion on this.
Well, I agree with you, Albio. I don't think that, given the history of Latin America, we have any business thinking about armed intervention. But I think we're doing the right thing to work through the Lima Group, to work through the OAS. We got another resolution out of the OAS, I think, last week, criticizing the effort to intimidate Guaido with the National Assembly business, and continue some of the aid that we can't get into Venezuela to help those countries that the chairman mentioned, so they don't become destabilized by the massive numbers of Venezuelans that have gone there. And I think that's been a good thing. One little known thing that we did was we passed a little law in one of the funding bills last year to make it quicker and easier to license small refineries in the Caribbean to provide an alternative to PetroCaribe. You think about destabilization, some of these little Caribbean countries are totally dependent on PetroCaribe.
Yep.
And that's just one small thing. The Verdad Act, offers some promise of more applying visa restrictions to some of these people who have had assets frozen and things like that. And it'd be real helpful if we could use our clout to get Europe to step up, like the chairman said. I mean, here we got Gustavo Carvajal sitting there in Spain. You know, we had the chance to nab him in a Curacao and didn't do it.
So it does seem to me that there's a policy. Yeah, go ahead, Mr.
I just want to say, talking about the refineries, we visited Curacao last year also. And Curacao has a refinery,
Big one.
a big refinery in Curacao. And the government was complaining about the influence and the crime increase from the Venezuelans that have wound up in Curacao. The refinery was just sold, which is a good thing for Curacao because that's part of their income. And it was sold to a European company, if I'm not mistaken, an American-owned but established in Switzerland base. One of those smart business people. So it's all good. And, you know, there are rumors out there and people saying that maybe some of the oil from Guyana could be refined in Curacao since they're so close. So there's a lot of good possibilities there in the future.
Just to focus on the migration crisis, arguably the worst in Latin American history, moving away from the challenge of the political and economic crisis within Venezuela, there has been an effort by the administration clearly, although not very successfully, to press the Europeans to take stronger sanctions measures and further isolate the Maduro regime in Venezuela. But it seems like much less of an effort from the United States to mobilize donors in the international community to address the migration challenges. My colleague Cindy Arntzen has written in Foreign Affairs about the scale of the challenges in Colombia and elsewhere, and the great financing needs that the Red Cross, that the International Organization of Migration have identified. In cases like this, historically, the U.S. has been a real leader in mobilizing the international community to provide a humanitarian response equal to the challenge. It does not appear that we have played that catalyzing role in this moment, and I don't know if it's linked into domestic questions of migration, to views of foreign assistance, to relationships with the Europeans and other major donors. But I do want to put that question to you, whether the Verdad Act is enough to provide the resources these countries need to provide adequate, education, healthcare, and safety for these migrants, and also to avoid the destabilizing influences and the potential problematic impacts on local politics that can happen, and we've seen in Europe, when there are these surges in migration.
Well, I think we have contributed something like $500 million to the whole issue of the Venezuelan exodus. Colombia needs that, and some of the other country needs that. In my conversations with the president of Colombia, he's very concerned that although the people of Colombia have accepted a great deal of Venezuelans in the country, they're starting to resent the amount of people coming over. Colombia's got its issues. They have their problems. And I think there's something like 1.4 million Venezuelans in Colombia. And he expects to have about 2 million by the end of the year. For a country that has got its own issues, bringing in 2 million people where you're going to have to provide them with health, jobs, and all these other things that people need to get themselves going, is a very difficult task. So the fact that we are helping, these countries. When I went to Cucuta, I was floored to see the situation there. You have people from Venezuela with kids walking 4 or 5 hours to get a lunch. Okay? You have people at these soup kitchens that they had in the thousands, not in the hundreds, at a session. They have lines, block long, 3, 4, waiting to get the lunch at there's a priest there. I told him, you should be canonized for what you're doing here, for the people and the work that you're doing. You have 1,000 people waiting to use the bathrooms. I mean, it's something you have to see in order to understand the gravity of it. I mean, I never seen anything like it. And luckily, we have been helping with this issue. If we were not there, I don't know, what Colombia would do. And they're very grateful that we have stepped up helping them with some of this money. But, you know, I went right down to the border. You know, and it's sickening that the soldiers from Venezuela charge these people $1 to cross this bridge so they can get a lunch. Well, you know where that money goes. The Venezuelan military. And you see the people buying stuff and lugging the stuff back to Venezuela because they have nothing. They have nothing in Venezuela. Kids are fainting in the schools. It's just a situation that is really bad for a country so rich. So I just...
Let me just follow up, Congressman Rooney, whether we have done enough to mobilize the international community on this issue. I think there seems to be a sense that, given the scale of this migration crisis, this is a global issue. This is not a Latin America issue or merely a U.S. responsibility, but that the international community hasn't yet recognized the scale of the challenge and the implications for countries like Colombia. Do you have a sense that diplomatically we've been effective on this subject?
Well, I think we could do a lot more to draw Europe into our hard power responses, like the visas and the sanctions and stuff like that. We can't let them skate, because it's like pushing a rope. We can do all we want to do here, but as long as they can go to Europe, they can get around us. And that's why I think it's critical that we engage them in the hard side of things. In the money side of aid, boy, I mean, 6 million people, how do you, it's like a Somalia or a Syria level immigration crisis here. And I guess the biggest frustrating thing to me is, in the history of coups, and there's a couple of people in this room that are familiar with them, as am I, I've never seen a situation where none of the army would break ranks after so much hardship in the country. And it's probably not since Stalin and the Iron Curtain has anybody been able to perpetrate that level of hardship in their country and still not have an insurrection. And we haven't cracked the code on that yet.
The reason, I think we both feel the same way, is that the army is part of the corruption that's in Venezuela.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, they're in charge of some of these. They're getting wealthy. They're getting on the whole crisis in Venezuela.
I know a guy in Venezuela had a perfectly fine refinery, and he couldn't get any oil. So he sold it for pennies on the dollar. We talked about this at the Atlantic Council the other day. Pennies on the dollar to a friend of Chavez, and guess what? PDVSA started selling him oil. It's happening all over the place.
Yeah.
The subcommittee later this afternoon is holding a hearing looking at security issues in Mexico that I thought we should focus on. And I could also note those interested in that subject, our colleagues in our Mexico Institute on the 6th floor are having an event that I encourage you to attend afterward, looking at this subject for the next few hours. What I wanted to ask is, the Merida Initiative for a time had been seen as a model of foreign assistance, in that it really deepened a relationship that had been fraught for generations with the Mexican intelligence services, the Mexican armed forces and security services, and seemed to have some promising results in building and strengthening the rule of law in a country with typically much stronger institutions than the counterparts, certainly in the Northern Triangle, where it seems like a much steeper climb. And yet, last year, data suggests was the most violent on record in terms of homicides, and despite pretty significant U.S. spending over the last decade, probably over $2 billion. Mexico seems nowhere closer. Pardon?
$3 billion.
Seems nowhere closer to solving issues with narcotics trafficking and, again, high levels of corruption that really undermine rule of law institutions. I wonder, I don't want to steal your thunder from your hearing later today, but I do want to address the subject, given that some Americans have been very directly and tragically affected by this very recently, that has captured the attention in the United States to the challenges Mexico has really been grappling with for years.
Well, look, the reason I'm having this hearing this afternoon is because I was one of the biggest proponents for the Merida Initiative. I felt that we could help Mexico and all this. But after $3 billion later, it seems that Mexico is less safe now than when we started this initiative. And I want to know why. I want to know where the $3 billion that the American people spent are, and where did it go? When you have an increase from last year to this year, 30%, I think, in the deaths, you have families that have been shut up. You have 13 police officers that were killed recently. I have members that tell me that they used to go to Mexico and with their families, and now they won't go. They had a situation the other day where they shot up this car and killed a 13-year-old boy. I mean, somewhere along the line, they have to make this country secure. And I know they keep blaming us, and we probably have some responsibility in this with the guns that come from here to Mexico and the drugs that we use and everything else. But at the same time, you know, you got to take care of your own house too. And we'll see what this hearing, you know, at least this afternoon. I'm hopeful that'll be a good hearing. It'll be well attended, and people will try to, see what we can do.
Yeah, just like the Uribe approach versus Santos, I think scholars like the Wilson Center will debate for years Calderon's approach versus Piñaneto's. And, Calderon took a lot of heat, but he definitely put a clamp down on corruption and on violence, particularly in the northern part of Mexico, Chihuahua, Tamaulipas, and stuff like that, and down where the Sinaloa and Nayarit gangs are. Piñaneto kind of released that a little bit, and it's tragic. The killing of all the journalists down there, the power that the drug gangs have mixed up with the army, and now you got AMLO in there. I don't know what he's going to want to do. I don't know. His past would not tend to indicate he's going to be hard on the gangs, but we'll see what he's going to do. I can tell you a personal story. Just before I got into this line of work, I had to go down to Mexico to see the chief of staff of the president. And so I was flying into Toluca, and I got a call from a friend that I've worked with here, and he said, when you land, tell your pilots to go to this hangar over there. And the door was open. We pulled in. They shut the door. It's kind of like the old days back in Bogota. And I said, this is a little eerie for Mexico, But that's the way it is for some American businessmen down there. Some of the drug guys even stole a Gulfstream 4 that belonged to a Fortune 100 company right there in Toluca. It's pretty brazen, huh?
Yeah, it's so we'll see what this hearing this afternoon. There are not too many people that are happy that I'm having this hearing this afternoon. I just want you to know that. But I think
leans forward, man. He's good.
This business of hugs, not bullets, I don't know how far that's going to go. In trying to make Mexico safe.
You can't talk about safety, though, without talking about that corrupt army, man.
Right.
They're in there. The financial system, the army, and the drug gangs are all in it together.
We've talked about the challenge of drawing policymaker attention to crises even at the scale of Venezuela in the U.S. and international attention. I want to turn to Nicaragua, where the democratic backsliding is nearly as dramatic. The repression of dissent and of journalists is nearly as severe as in Venezuela. And the House of Representatives passed a resolution recently trying to draw more focus domestically to this subject. The resolution referred to the progressive deterioration of democratic conditions and accused the Ortega regime of gross violations of human rights and acts of repression and urged continued pressure by the U.S. government. My question is, what tools, and this is a similar challenge to Venezuela, where it seems like sanctions are our only idea and our only suggestion for improving the result is additional sanctions and tightening of sanctions. I wonder if there's any other approaches that you have advocated or could conceive of to try to draw more attention, focus, and effective pressure on the Ortega regime in Nicaragua?
Well, when you look at Nicaragua, you're looking at someone who's looking over to Venezuela and seeing that he's getting away with this. I'm going to try to get away with this. And we cannot allow that. We have put sanctions on Nicaragua. Every time they do something, we try to ratchet up. To include the relatives, the NICA Act, where they can get money, unless it's some sort of, it has to be approved and reviewed. And I mean, we just don't want money going to Ortega. His whole family now, they're millionaires. This is the great guy that was in the mountains for the people of Nicaragua, and I'm going to do this for the people of Nicaragua. He turns out to be just as corrupt as Maduro. And his family is now very, very wealthy. And this is the problem that you don't know, you have, not just in Nicaragua, but in some of these places. People talk a good game. When they get there, they just forget about the people. And unfortunately, this is what's happening in Nicaragua. So on my capacity, whatever I can, working with the State Department, we will continue to ratchet up the pressure that we can put on Nicaragua, especially when it comes to journalists and the shutting down newspapers. I mean, look, this is a game plan that was started in Cuba, going on to Venezuela, going on into Nicaragua. I lived it. I saw it and ratchet up little by little in Cuba. And little by little in Venezuela, they did the same thing. And I had a lunch with, to his credit, Vice President Pence called me to his office to have a lunch and talk about the Western Hemisphere. And I mentioned to him that this is a game plan. I'm talking about a couple of years ago, that is happening, not just, they started in Cuba, going into Venezuela, and now going into Nicaragua. You know, they'll start, after these things, they'll start going after possessions, like you said, companies, and they'll keep doing it. So whatever I can do to put pressure on Nicaragua, I will do. Because we cannot let Nicaragua go by the way of Venezuela, even though it's getting there. So it's just very difficult. They have over 50,000 people now going into Costa Rica from Nicaragua. Again, putting pressure on Costa Rica to deal with this. Not only with the migrants that go to Costa Rica, but now you have 50,000 Nicaraguans going into Costa Rica and growing.
Which is really unfortunate because as late as 4 years ago, you know, the statistics in Nicaragua were quite good. There was no immigration, unemployment was low, the people of all socioeconomic levels polled very supportive of Ortega before this business with his wife began. I've got a lot of friends down there. I do a lot of business with Carlos Pellis and Carlos Lacayo and some of those guys, and all of a sudden overnight it just flipped. And the one thing I have thought of is this anomaly of only 30%, I think it takes to win a presidential election in Nicaragua. That's how Ortega got in 2007. We worked very hard, United States, on a broad level of intelligence and State Department to keep Ortega from winning in 2007. And got pretty close. But that 30% rule is something maybe we could work through the OAS and some other Latin American fountains of speaking, I can think in Spanish, anyway, that could bring visibility to that. But at the end of the day, as the chairman said, if you don't cut Cuba off, you're not going to cut Nicaragua off, and Venezuela too.
Let me ask one more question.
Just
Yeah, go
want
ahead.
to say, you know what? It just burns me that you have Nicaragua, you have the wife putting up these trees all over Managua, lights and everything else. They're $25,000. I don't know if you've seen pictures of them. There's some sort of a tree with lights and everything else. Meanwhile, $25,000. What a waste of money. The Nicaraguan people are actually setting them on fire because they're so upset that they're spending this money on this crap. You know, when it is one of the countries that needs the most in the whole region. If you haven't seen it, I suggest you look up and you see the picture of this tree.
Let me ask one more question, and then we're going to turn to our participants for others, which is a question about corruption in the region. It's come up frequently in these conversations on diverse subjects, from the Venezuelan military to questions of the wealth accumulated by the Ortega family. The U.S. approach to corruption, it seemed pretty consistently and in a bipartisan way, was to address it as one of the causes of poor government services, a tax on the poor, a reason for inefficient government, and worse. And a reason why the professionalization of security services, particularly in Northern Central America, has been so difficult, despite a long period of significant U.S. assistance, including technical assistance. And yet, we've now seen Guatemala close its UN-backed CICIG, anti-corruption agency, and there seems to still be ambiguity as to whether Honduras will be able to come to a decision to continue to work with the Organization of American States, the OAS, which also has a comparable body in Honduras that's addressing systemic corruption. My question is whether we are prioritizing adequately the question of corruption in our diplomatic engagements in the Northern Triangle and elsewhere in Latin America at a moment where it had seemed like the region was really rallying around this subject, starting and led by Brazil and moving elsewhere. I'll start with you, Representative Rooney. Do you get the sense that anti-corruption is still a priority for U.S. policy in Latin America?
Well, you'd have to look at what happened with CICIG. Grant you, Yvonne got a little out of hand on some of the cases towards the end, but the fact that we did not support keeping CICIG kind of would tend to say no. I think that there have been some encouraging cases out of Africa dealing with extraterritorial jurisdiction of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is something that might offer some possibility in Latin America as well, where a company like Total could suppliers to Total in Africa that had no business in the United States could get drawn in. And we've got to do something to make these people accountable.
Chairman Sires.
I'm all for accountability. Anywhere we put a dollar, I'm all for accountability of that dollar. And, you talked about CICIG and you talk about some of the prosecutors. Once they disbanded, they had to leave the country because they fell for their lives. We should be in there saying, hey, and we are, but we're just not emphatic enough to say we need this. Otherwise, there's very little thing that we can do for you. I mean, we have a situation where the woman that was heading in Guatemala, Aldana, she had to leave the country.
Attorney General.
Because she got too close to the president's brother. I mean,
well, maybe just to Honduras, I mean, do you get the sense that the U.S. currently, whether the administration or in your interactions from the Hill, are doing enough to preserve Honduras's version of CICIG, its MASI, its OAS-backed anti-corruption organization?
I don't know. I haven't heard any efforts to undermine them.
No.
They haven't been up to see us like Yvonne did all the time.
no, we haven't heard.
I can tell you on the chairman's subject there about this corruption, though, I can tell you in some of my lines of work, no legitimate competitor will deal with the government entities. The only ones that will are kind of illegitimate, whether it's Concreto in Colombia or our business in Mexico, Central America. We only deal with private people. And that tells you a lot about the nature of the problem. Also tells you a lot about Mexico when you look at ICA and some of the big companies that are so tied in with the PRI and the government. It's just the opposite side of the coin.
Let's take 3 questions, and then we'll see if we have a moment. We have a microphone? Okay. One over here, and Joel. Just please introduce yourself and be as brief as possible. We'll have brief answers, and we'll see if we can have another round.
Thank you, Ben.
I think it's on. It sounds like it's on. No?
Thank you, Ben. Jose Cardenas, I'm a consultant here in Washington. I wanted to go back to the issue of Nicaragua. Mr. Chairman, you mentioned that you're interested in ideas about how to further put pressure on the Ortega regime. One of the ideas that I've heard being circulated in the administration is either suspending or throwing out Nicaragua from CAFTA. I wanted to know both of your opinions on that idea.
I haven't heard that.
I hadn't heard
Okay.
it. It's interesting.
Hold on, I'm gonna take 3, and then we'll address them as we want.
I may forget what you asked.
I'll remind you.
Hi, thank you very much for being here. David Nelson, I'm also a consultant here in Washington, a retired Foreign Service officer. I want to go back to your discussion of the cartels in Mexico. As you noted, they pose a security threat to the U.S., the drug flow of drugs, the violence. They're enabled by Mexico's corruption, but fueled largely by the flow of money and arms from the U.S. Over the last 15 years, the U.S. government has built up a very powerful tool to trace the flow of money to terrorists centered around the Treasury Department. Why is that tool not being used more effectively to focus on the cartels in Mexico?
Excellent. And here in the back. And we'll divide these up amongst you if we can, just so we can get to another round.
Joy Olson, I'm also a consultant. Two-parter, Venezuela. It seems that that the only way out in Venezuela is free and fair elections. So what more do you think needs to be done to get to that point? What more do you think you can do to help get to that point? And two, that Washington Post article about the deportations of asylum seekers to Guatemala, putting them on a plane, them not even knowing what country they're going to, and leaving them hanging there is just heartbreaking and disturbing. And I also want to know what you can do to change that.
Okay, excellent. So we will be ideally brief in responses, and we'll have time for one or two other rounds. I'm going to let you both choose which you want to reply. Let's start with Nicaragua and the idea of potentially expelling Nicaragua from the Central America Free Trade Agreement as a sanction and as a way to pressure the Ortega government. Who wants to address that?
Well, quite frankly, I haven't heard too much about that. I guess that's the nuclear option. After all the other options have been implemented. Why, if it's going to be effective, I will probably support it, as long as I think it's going to be effective. But I haven't heard too much in that.
The question there is Ortega going to care?
Right.
I mean, he's turned it into a closed-loop economy, just like many Venezuela or Cuba now.
Well, that's the other option. You put all these sanctions on this. Some people don't care. They don't care that the hardship on the population. They don't care as long as they keep making money when they are in office.
Congressman Rooney, the question on Mexico, that we have excelled at countering terrorism financing and have a lot of effective tools to do so. The question is whether we can bring any of those technologies and tools to bear on guns and money that fuel the cartel violence in Mexico.
Yeah, I mean, I know we know a lot. I know how many people we have in Miami and Luxembourg and a few other places. And we have great capabilities now to follow money. Question is, what do we know and what do we use and what do we disclose? We may know a lot more than we're publicly saying or using because of all those sovereignty issues with Mexico. You know, Mexico's a complicated place, just like the some of the business about sanctions and stuff. You know, there was one thing about labeling the cartels as a foreign terror organization, and a lot of people in the department feel that would just drive Mexico's chip on their shoulder about sovereignty, if you will, even worse. So I prefer to think we know a lot more that's going on than we're saying, but I'm not so sure that we've been willing to use it as openly against Mexico as other places.
Chairman Sires, on the question on Venezuela, I mean...
Okay, one more thing.
Yeah, please.
Now, whether that's tied into AMLO playing team ball with Trump's immigration agenda, I don't know. You could connect some dark dots there, but that's just
I agree with that.
paranoia I have.
On Venezuela, both of you are clearly on record opposing a U.S. military intervention, discouraged but acknowledging that it seems like the Venezuelan military itself is not going to depose this regime and bring about a democratic, peaceful transition. So the question is if elections is the most likely path towards some kind of resolution to the political and economic crisis, how do we get there, and what role could the United States and the international community play in bringing about some reasonably free and fair elections in Venezuela?
Well, look, I felt that Guaido would play this hand a little bit early on. I feel that the only way to solve this problem is the true election in Venezuela. How do we get there? That's not an easy question to answer. You know, I mentioned before that the administration now seems to be taking another vehicle, another road in trying to talk to Maduro. Maybe they have some sort of understanding about an election coming up. I'm not very hopeful, but you also have to understand that there are a lot of people that have put their lives on the line over the last few years, over the last couple of months, and for election. And remember this, one of the reasons that Venezuela is in the situation that it is because the opposition was divided for many years. The opposition was divided, and you got some of these people elected. So we cannot, one of the things that we have to do if we're going to have elections is make sure the opposition is not divided. And we should use all we can to make sure that that opposition stays together. I said this to the Venezuelans when I visited them in Florida. The largest population of Venezuelans in this country live in Florida. And I said, remember, you were divided, right? You cannot divide yourself now if we're going to proceed to trying to get elections in Venezuela, because it's just going to happen the same way. When Chavez was there, he was able to divide the opposition and get elected.
Congressman Rooney.
Oh, man, I'm having a flashback to the nightmare of Caldera letting Chavez out of jail and actively, quietly supporting Chavez's legitimacy in 97 and 98. I mean, how stupid. But neither here nor there. You know, this may sound, this
Water
may
under the
seem,
bridge.
I haven't totally thought this out, but, you know, we've been talking about Iran a lot lately. Who can bring pressure on the Venezuelan government? They don't really care what we do, as long as they've got that army. Maybe there's some way, and this may sound a little squashy here, but maybe there's some way to work with Iran and Russia to have them align their interest somehow differently than they seem to be. I mean, right now, it's like a shuttle between Tehran and Caracas. And, but I don't know how anybody else would influence them to do a fair election. You know, maybe there's a deal to cut with Iran under the table to
The Lima Group.
extract out of what we're in with Iran in exchange for them helping there. I don't know, but something, it's going to take something serious.
Go ahead, then we have time for two very quick final questions, and
Nobody
then we've
addressed
committed.
Joy's question. Obviously, immigration is the purview of other committees, but the whole issue of how Central Americans are treated in the United States.
The immigration issue?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like to.
Well, the immigration issue is something that has become really difficult to deal with, quite frankly. It's gotten a bad name. There's a lot of misconception about immigration and the contribution. I'll just give you an example. I have a bill in to extend the Canadian stay in this country a couple of months more. I don't know if you know this, but Canadians spend millions and millions of dollars in this country, especially in Florida.
Mm-hmm. I'm on your bill.
Yeah.
Yeah, somebody.
Wonder
So I
why.
figured, look, these people come to America, they spend millions of dollars, give them a couple of more months. Well, nobody wants to touch it because they feel that that's immigration. Now, I'm talking about money for Arizona, I'm talking about money for Florida, I'm talking about money for all these other places where the Canadians hang out. I mean, I have a place in Florida, the guy next door is a Canadian. And he's got this house, and he's got a couple of houses down the street. But, you know, people like immigration, I said, oh, we don't want to touch it. I said, look, this is America that can benefit. So the immigration issue, I belong to the Hispanic caucus, and for many years we pushed comprehensive immigration. I think they're starting to realize that, you know, we have to go piece by piece on immigration. That you're never, the way the situation is in this country now, you're going to get a comprehensive immigration bill through, even through the House now. I think you're going to have to go step by step on immigration. I mean, we had a caucus meeting the other day, and the approach that they say we have to change our approach on immigration. And I was one of the ones that pushed with Luis Gutierrez for years for comprehensive immigration, but I'm starting to realize that this is a step here, small step here, small step here, small step here to get here. And I'm an immigrant myself.
Most everybody in this room is.
Right.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the scorpion and the frog in the Middle East, you know? I mean, it's very frustrating. I worked so hard on the 2007 bill, George W.'s bill, trying to recruit support. And that amnesty thing came up, which was total BS, but that's what they did. And then worked hard on the 2013 bill, Rubio and the Gang of Eight. Boehner wouldn't bring it up because he would have lost his speakership as a
Lost it
result
anyway.
because of the Freedom Caucus. And now what the chairman said, in the 4 years I've been doing this, I've seen so many deals to do different portions of the immigration, to deal with different portions of the immigration challenge. And they all fall apart for one reason or another when they get to the 10-yard line. It's either the Freedom Caucus or the super liberals.
Yeah.
And it's just very frustrating. And I think one problem we have in Congress is we don't have enough business people down there that actually hire people. Because if you hire people, you're going to have a much more human and economic support for the immigration that built our country than these rabid ideologues on both sides that have no idea what economics or employees are all about. That's just personal opinion.
Yeah, and I'll share this with you because I share this with all my friends. I came to this country in 1962. My mother, my father, and my brother. I went in Miami to the immigration center, the refugee center. At the refugee center, they knew that we were heading for New Jersey. They gave me a coat, they gave me a hat, they gave me gloves. They gave my brother the same thing. I have been paying for those gloves, that hat, and that coat for 57 years. You know, with the taxes that I paid, it's the best investment this country's ever made. It was a small investment. I set up a business. I employed people. I pay my taxes. I'm still paying through my nose.
You know,
I'm still contributing.
when you look at economics and the need to have a growing population to drive a growing economy, to have a young population to support retirement benefits in a growing economy, we should thank our lucky stars every day that there's all these young Hispanics who share our Judeo-Christian ethic of the Western Hemisphere that want to come up here and work. And, you know, you can't get a building built, yard cut, kitchen cleaned, hog slaughtered without those Hispanic workers. And it just drives me crazy that the ideologues don't seem to connect those dots.
And my father was taken away, and he was vetted for about a week, from what I remember, to see if he was a member of the Communist Party and all that stuff, which, you know, I don't have a problem people being vetted coming to this country at all. So immigration is a...
Jim, before we move on, I just want to thank Director Jane Harmon, former member of Congress from California, for joining us for this
We miss you.
this session.
Yeah, please, of course.
applaud the conversation we just heard on immigration, and I was there in 2007 and proudly voted for immigration. Jane, can you use a microphone because we're webcasting? I'm not sure people can.
Well, I'd like to say that again. I applaud the conversation we just heard, the bipartisan conversation about a serious issue. And I was in Congress in 2007 and proudly voted for the comprehensive immigration bill. And I think the comments sadly portray where we are now. But it is a real pleasure for the Wilson Center to serve as a safe political space for people who have trouble talking to each other sometimes back in my old place of employ. And I also want to applaud the Latin American program for the kinds of programming that it does. So welcome to former colleagues and welcome to a packed audience at the crack of dawn. Very impressive.
Thank you so much, Jane, and thank you all very much for being here. And please, if you would, unfortunately, we are out of time, but please join me in thanking the Congressman for such an interesting and candid conversation.
Thank you, Benjamin.
Thank you.